Good morning, everyone. My name is Conor Shaw. I'm from University College Dublin, and I believe that equipping facilities management practitioners with digital tools is really essential if we're going to better organize and operate and maintain our existing built assets. So on this note, I'm going to present to you today a paper by myself and my colleagues entitled Facilities Management Domain Review, Potential Contributions Towards Digitalization. So it doesn't happen in isolation, of course. I worked on this paper with my colleagues at UCD, James and Ciaran, as well as Flavia, who's based out of CARTIF in Spain. And this project is funded by the Cloud BIM network. It's a Horizons 2020 European funded research project where myself and 13 other PhD students are looking at cloud enabled BIM solutions in different topic areas. So the objectives of this paper, it was the first publication of my PhD, which I started last September. So I'm starting with a domain review, gathering the key literature of the domain of facilities management, of digitization, and also trying to specify what I mean by certain terms. So looking at selecting definitions and identifying those key subtopics and challenges which need to be addressed, which help then to guide my future research direction. So from a high level point of view, the reason for looking at facilities management, it really comes from a place of the energy, the climate crisis that we're currently in the middle of, coming from the burning of fossil fuels and release of greenhouse gas emissions. It's become clear that buildings are a significant contributor to this, and over the last couple of decades, we've started to take a more whole life view of products generally, but also buildings, and we're seeing that the operational phase is a great significant contributor to the energy use of buildings. So particularly in existing assets, which are low thermally performing, this is a very large proportion, gets less so with newer buildings. So facilities managers or building operators, as those in charge of maintaining and operating, optimizing buildings, building energy, they have a real significant opportunity to reduce this. So FM kind of comes to us from the 19th century. It was a concept that came about as a result of the US railway companies, which started to think about their various assets, their trains, their stations, their tracks, more as a utility rather than their individual parts. But it's not until the 20th century that we see the term facilities management actually used. But today we think of facilities management as an organization which takes care of multiple assets on behalf of another organization. So it's an outsourcing of non-core activities. So I've taken a definition which keeps this very broad view of facilities management. So it's not based on just commercial organizations, but can be any organization. But it's that outsourcing of non-core related activities so that an organization can focus on its main primary objectives. So this paper was a domain review looking at current literature, and in this process we identified the key domain challenges. I'm going to talk through each of those. So firstly, we've got this very, very broad diversity of activities that can be associated with facilities management. So that can be anything from operating and maintaining buildings, energy, dealing with waste, dealing with cleaning, can go in anything to security, even down to catering. So it's extremely broad, and for this reason, it's been very hard to standardize. We've also got this very decentralized supply chain, building on just the very complex nature of construction generally. This is very different to the supply chains we'd be used to seeing in manufacturing, where it's quite top down. But we've got a very, very loose and diverse supply chain with facilities management, again, reflecting that activity diversity. And as I said, this all leads to lacks of standards. Although recently we've seen some developments in FM standardization, typically, as you see in the picture on the right, the handover phase from construction to a facilities management company is a little chaotic and typically document based, as you see here. And this builds on the fact that there is an issue in the domain of getting FM teams involved at an appropriate stage of construction, design and construction projects. Typically, FM teams are becoming familiar with the contents of a building, even the data specifications, at a very late stage when they can have very little influence over that data or those data structures that they're going to be using to manage the building. So work needs to be done there. It's a big challenge. So all of this leads to a quite low productivity in the domain. So this is a dated but very widely and foundational, widely cited and foundational piece of research, which gives us grounds, and I think is still quite relevant today, that quite a lot of the waste is coming from manual retrieval of documents by facilities management personnel. So in answer to this, we look to digitalization, and this can be reflected in recent work. This is a study which looks at the use of the terms BIM and FM within literature, and you can see there's a growing interest there towards digitalization of the facilities management domain. So although there's growing interest, we're still currently in this very designer-led BIM paradigm. So we're in this BIM paradigm where projects are gathering data throughout their design, throughout their construction, and it's kind of this handover of data over to facilities management teams. And that data can often be in unusable or inappropriate formats, or leading to also different kinds of wastes, even information that might not be needed at all. So although this leads to this topic coming up a lot in the literature of interoperability challenge. So we'll see this in other domains as well, of course. But basically, although there are lots of solutions and many pieces of FM related BIM and digitization literature, there's not one really that's been evolved to the point or been accepted as an all-encompassing direction. So what we found in the paper was that semantic web-based approaches seem to be considered as having really high potential for solving interoperability challenges by the authors. So there's been growing interest in that topic. And some of the reasons why semantic web approaches are of interest are because they move us away from this file exchange based workflows more to query based. So it's a much more granular, much more finely selectable way of doing the exchange requirements between participants. It's also moving towards a more open data format and a more machine readable data format. So moving away from proprietary systems. And all of this holds the promise that there's a far better ability for accessibility between various stakeholders. and it's seen as having great potential to democratize the BIM methodology. So, as I've said, some of the main conclusions of this paper, standardization was seen as it's being very complex because of the activity diversity. It's very complex to standardize this profession, but from the reading, those efforts that do attempt to standardize both in the definition of facilities management and in data formats, in processes, they are desirable. So, for example, the ISO 19650 Part 3 recently has some FM standards put down, and that's very useful for understanding and kind of standardizing the organization of project teams and expectations in projects. Likewise, bottom-up approaches in standardization, like the COBie data sets, are also seen as very, very useful. Although it's found in this paper that the one shoe fits all approach may not be entirely well received by practitioners. So that's one to just be careful with. As I said, semantic web-based developments are seen as very promising to address interoperability, and that's where, since writing this paper, the research has gone into to look into this more depth. I'll talk about it in a moment. And the issue of early facility management involvement in projects. So this is the paper found some really key literature on that topic as well, and there does exist precedence around the world for that kind of early involvement, and that which can perhaps get us closer to the promise of a BIM methodology. So through contract forms like integrated project deliveries, public-private partnerships, which basically incentivize operations stage thinking in the design. So when you can have the greatest influence on the design to be working for your operations and maintenance phase. So this is an area of interest for sure. And the other thing we found was a number of under-researched topics. So an example of this is health and safety management in facilities management. But a key one that I thought was interesting was that of renovation. So this was more broadly than just for facilities management, but actually we found there was a clear disincentive for researchers to look at the renovation issue. And that's really because of an absence of data. It's much easier to go and conduct a piece of research when you have some data, but as we know, for the existing stock, we lack that in a lot of cases. So that was an interesting finding, and is of great interest to our cloud BIM network as well. That's an area of focus for us. So as far as next steps from this piece of work, in the interim, I've been working along with my colleagues on a second publication, which is under review at the moment. And that is a comprehensive review of semantic web-based FM literature and approaches, also in industry. So that'll be out soon. And what we're doing now is working on defining an FM use case that I'll look at for the remainder of my PhD. So I hope this has been interesting to you, and if you have any questions, I believe we have 5 minutes now to take some questions, and you can always get in touch with me via my email address there. And thanks for listening. Thanks for your attention.